How y'all doing? Spent a little bit of time outside today. It was good. Welcome, everybody. Man, how y'all feeling today? Welcome to another Healthy Gamer GG stream. My name is Alok Kanoja. A reminder that although I am a psychiatrist, nothing we discuss on stream today is intended to be taken as medical advice. Everything today that we're going to be talking about is for educational and entertainment purposes only. So if you have a concern or question, please go see a licensed professional. Quitting cigarettes, so I'm doing horribly. Yeah, that's rough. It's funny. We're going to talk a little bit about that today. So, one of the funniest things is that, the one substance that's pretty much allowed at all rehabs are like cigarettes, usually. If they allow something, that is. So some of them are, nothing, no vaping, no cigs, no anything. But it's so interesting because if you look at quitting nicotine, so we'll have rehabs for like opiates and alcohol and marijuana and technology, but there's no nicotine rehab. Y'all ever realize that? It's kind of interesting, huh? Not only is there not a nicotine rehab, but oftentimes, like at rehab facilities, nicotine is totally fine. Right? It's interesting. I'm not entirely sure why that is. It's just, I think that, some of it just has to do with like, you gotta let some people, or you gotta let people have something, is I guess what I wanted to say. You gotta give them something. You can't conquer the world all at once. You can't transform yourself in all of your negative aspects all at once, right? You gotta cut yourself some slack. You gotta give yourself a little bit of time. Yeah, someone's saying big tobacco is buying off rehabs. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe. Who knows? But I know I didn't get no big tobacco money when I was working in a rehab. I think it's just, I just don't think you can handle everything all at once. Yeah, so I think he was starting conspiracy theories. Yeah, so, I know that some people are into conspiracy theories and all that. My experience has been largely that, like, never assume a conspiracy when simple incompetence is an option. So that's how I feel about it. I think it's just too hard, right? Like, you got to give people some outlet as they're starting to gain sobriety and stuff like that. So we'll kind of, hold on a second. Wait, I can't make this more symmetrical because there's a plant here. That's not going to work. Okay, we're going to have to figure that out later. I just realized that the tables are asymmetrical. I don't know if you can see, but yeah. But that one is because there's a door and there's a plant. So I don't know what we're going to do about that. Okay, so I mean, only when I look at it, right? It's like, I don't know that it bothers me. It's just, I was looking at it and I was like, oh, like maybe we can make it symmetrical. And then as I went to do it, I realized, okay, we can't. So I don't know that it's going to bother me. Are you into feng shui? Not particularly, but I've always been curious about it. And, there's a Indian equivalent of feng shui called Vastu Shastri, which also is something that I've been curious about. But then I think, about a decade ago, a little over a decade ago, maybe 12, 14 years ago, I kind of like moved away from a lot of the mystical stuff. I was trying to think about what the right word is. So like I spent time like learning all this stuff like for several years, and then, ultimately did neuroscience research, went to medical school, stuff like that. But I've always been curious about it because I've always been curious about, there's this general principle that things that offer some kind of utility tend to survive. So we see this if you look at the history of medicine. So like when something works, it like hangs around for a while, right? So aspirin, for example, was derived from a tree bark, and like that tree bark was used for hundreds or thousands of years by a particular group of people. And so since it's effective, it like it survives, right? Whereas like you have things like the theories of humors, for example, which don't survive because there's not some reality to them. And so you'll have these things like Chinese medicine, for example, that have been around for thousands of years. And part of the reason for that, there are all these different systems of medicine that we've never seen because they've gone extinct. Culpeper's medicine is a good example of this because no one's ever heard of it. It was like, people like, what is Culpeper's medicine? No one knows because it wasn't very effective, so it didn't last, right? Some guy had this idea and kind of, developed a system of medicine based on particular observations, and they didn't really seem to offer a whole lot of utility. Whereas you've got other things like Chinese medicine, where they use something called red yeast rice to manage certain symptoms of elemental imbalances, right, according to their system. And chances are, even though the elemental imbalance isn't something that you can biopsy, it's something that you can observe. You can say, okay, this person has an elemental imbalance, right? And then you can give them a particular herb, and they seem to get better. It seems to fix the elemental imbalance. And then many years later, thousands of years later, a pharmaceutical company comes along, starts to investigate this stuff, and starts to realize, oh, that's interesting. It turns out that red yeast rice has this compound in it called a statin. And then they patent it. They research it, purify it, patent it. And then Lipitor or statin drugs are born, which turn out to be very effective. And then, it's kind of interesting, right? But like that drug has been used for thousands of years in a traditional medical system. And so now like statins are one of the most prescribed drugs in the world because they help with cholesterol. So it's kind of interesting. So there's stuff like Vastu Shastri and Feng Shui and things like that. I would love to explore them more and see if there's really some kind of like science behind it, right? But it's just hard. Like, I wouldn't know how to go about doing that. Is red yeast rice effective, though? Would doctors recommend it? I doubt doctors would recommend it because most people don't know what red yeast rice is, right? So this is where we see this a lot, where when something gets scientifically verified and given a new name, the origin of the thing gets lost and people don't realize it, right? People don't know that there's an herbal alternative to statin drugs. And that's where, is it effective? Well, so remember that the potency of a statin drug also comes through chemical purification, right? So when you take red yeast rice, I would suspect that the cholesterol lowering effect of the red yeast rice would be less than what a statin drug offers and may not yield as much of a mortality benefit, et cetera, et cetera. So it may not be as effective. So, it's interesting. So that's the kind of thing, once again, if y'all have concerns about it, I would definitely talk to your doctor about it and see what's right for you. Because I don't know that the data for red yeast rice shows that it is as efficacious. I don't really know what the effect size of it is, the number needed to treat is, things like that. I just know about the history of the origin of the medicine. Yeah, so what someone's asking, why did China not come up with purifying it in all that time? In a sense, they may have. So they may have, actually. So if you look at the purifications of herbal medicines in Eastern medical traditions, they often involve things like boiling for a long period of time. So I once saw a Chinese medical doctor many years ago. And, part of my prescription, they gave me this sack of herbs, and I was supposed to boil it for 20 minutes. And so, it turned into, sludge. Right? So I think what's happening when you boil something for 20 minutes is you're concentrating it, right? And then so you extract it out and then you concentrate it, and then you're probably getting something closer to a statin drug. So it's interesting. There's a lot, current terminology is TCM. So that's the other thing, is that, many years ago, I think the Chinese government basically tried to standardize Chinese medicine. And in that process, they may have lost a lot of good stuff, but also made it a lot more accessible. If we overboil our veggies, can we get extra vitamins? Sort of, right? So if we look at cooking, we know that there is sort of this sweet spot where you're helping to break things down to make nutrients more accessible. But if you overcook it, then what you do is break down the nutrient itself. And that's probably why, they told me to boil it for 20 minutes. They didn't say 40, they didn't say 10. So my guess is that over time, they sort of figured out, okay, if we boil it for 30, it's not as effective. If we boil it for 10, it's not effective. 20 is the most basic, it seems to be the sweet spot. So someone's saying homeopathy is still around, but that's complete dog water. Yeah, when you say still around, homeopathy hasn't been around very long. I think homeopathy was developed in the 20s or something, 1920s. So it's less than 100 years old. So when we look at the history of alternative medical systems, Ayurveda and not TCM in its current form, but Chinese medicine have been around for thousands of years, right? So that's very different. So other things that have been around for thousands of years and still persist are things like Native American ayahuasca spiritual journeys, right? And so if we think about how is that persisted? Why is that persisted? Probably because there's some we know now, there's a psychoactive effect that clearly and consistently creates particular experiences, therefore is reinforced over time. Yeah, maybe it was 1800s. I don't know. Is Ayurveda legit? Parts of it. So I think we're about done doing our review of Ayurveda, and I think the biggest kind of conclusion so far is the Ayurvedic genomic stuff, the personality-oriented stuff, is not really very scientifically valid. So I think I did a poor study of the literature. I didn't look at it closely enough, which thankfully people in this community brought to our attention. So we've been like looking at a lot of papers, and the takeaway is that some of the Ayurvedic personality stuff is not very scientifically valid. Doesn't mean that it's invalid. It just means that the quality of the studies are quite small and they're very poorly powered. So it's small sample sizes, kind of interesting for sure. There's some possibility of something being there, but we haven't really verified it. Whereas other aspects of Ayurvedic medicine, like meditation, for example, are very, very valid. And that's also something that people tend to forget, which is that meditation is like part of that Ayurvedic tradition. So all of the studies on mindfulness were developed as a complement and come from the same place as Ayurveda. So yoga is valid, meditation is valid. Some of the Ayurvedic herbal remedies have been shown to be efficacious. The big challenge with Ayurveda, as you say, is it legit? That's where what we need to do is study all of the different aspects, right? So there's some things that have been shown to be legit. There's some things that have been shown to be dangerous and toxic. Like Rasa Shastra is a good example of that, where Ayurvedic physicians will use heavy metals as part of their therapeutics. And there's probably good biological plausibility behind that, because we know that heavy metals can cause they can help autoimmune conditions. They can help in cases like cancer. So some of our chemotherapies, for example, will use toxins, right, as a therapeutic benefit. So in Ayurveda, they will also use Rasa Shastra, but that's the kind of thing where it seems like kind of unclear whether Rasa Shastra was really that effective, or because in some cases it's used more widely. So that's like, is Ayurveda legit? It's not. It's like kind of saying like, is Western medicine legit? Well, some aspects of it are legit and some aspects aren't, right? The big advantage of Western medicine is that we tend to have a very, very good methodology of sifting out what is legit versus not legit. That's really the biggest strength of Western medicine, is that we're very, very good at being self-critical. So we'll come up with certain treatments like Vioxx, right, which will hit. Thalidomide is a good example. So, thalidomide is very, very, very effective at treating nausea. And then what happened is people originally, I think, developed it for cancer nausea. And then we started they're like, it worked so well that it started getting off-label prescribed to pregnant women with morning sickness because it worked so well. And then we discovered, unfortunately, that pregnant women who took thalidomide in the first trimester of pregnancy had children who were missing arms and legs. And then we were like, hold on a second, maybe we should not use this medicine. So that's actually, I think, a really, really good example of the strength of Western medicine. It's kind of terrifying, right? Because we have like aftermarket surveillance and some of these other things. So, except Western medicine has expanded life expectancy from 30 to 80, so maybe more true than not. That's actually factually, in my experience, incorrect. So if you look at life expectancy increases, there's actually data about this. The biggest thing that is probably correlated with life expectancy increases from 30 to 80 is not medical treatment, it's diet. So as we were able to feed more people and feed people healthier, life expectancy increased. The simplest way to think about that, right, there's like a face validity test, which is think about why you're not dead at 35. Like, why aren't people dying at 35, 40, and 45? It's not because of medical treatment. It's not like you're taking medicine every day from the age of 30, not usually anyway, right? You start taking medicine later in life. So where medicine really excels is like end stage stuff. So our system of medicine is very, very good at keeping people who are sick alive. So if we look at, heart attacks, for example, like we have heart attacks used to be fatal, and they're not necessarily anymore. Like that's the strength of medicine. Like there used to be some diseases like, autoimmune kidney diseases that used to be fatal. Like if you're a 15-year-old and you get an autoimmune kidney disease, you're dead. And now we have something called a kidney transplant, where we will take a kidney out of another human being and stick it in you. And what used to be mortality at the age of 15, now you can live until like 60 or 65. You may even get a second transplant after like 20 years. Right? So actually, the biggest increase in life expectancy is probably due to dietary improvements. If we really look at where Western medicine excels, it's in like keeping people who really should be dead alive. Like you've got 4 gunshots, like you've got 4 bullets inside you. We can fix that. It's amazing. Sorry, Doc, don't you think medicine has helped infant mortality and other early life problems? 100%. But if you do a regression analysis on what correlates with life expectancy increase over time, it's not the advent of medicine. It's antibiotics it's probably the biggest contributor, actually, now that I think about it. Antibiotics is probably the biggest part. But anyway, vaccines is another big part, sure. What are the baby elephants? Okay. Regression analysis is when you look at, so regression analysis is a statistical thing where you try to figure out which variables are associated with a particular thing. So if we look at life expectancy increase, we can look at all of the things that have changed and see which ones correlate to life expectancy increase. So if we look at people, and that's what a regression analysis is, it's trying to figure out what is correlated with a particular outcome. That's how we start to figure out what is responsible for a particular thing. Yeah, we're going to talk about, y'all want to talk about pornography addiction? Let's do it. Okay. Oh my God. All right. Let's dive in. So we've got some cool stuff to talk about today. Okay. So I like porn and masturbation, and I'm okay with that. Am I addicted? I see lately that the last 2-3 years, porn and masturbation are mostly portrayed as something bad. 10 to 15 years ago, it was absolutely okay, and there was a huge amount of papers that everyone masturbates, and it's healthy, though. It's healthy enough, I think. I know that everything could be an addiction. Reading, eating, exercises, how to tell an addiction from just a healthy thing. The thing is, though, I really like sex, arousal, and for me, it's something purely happy and positive. I just love it and unironically plan to start writing erotic/porn stories or fanfics. Usually porn is associated with something bad and low quality, and I think it shouldn't. We should get rid of prejudices, unhealthy ways of making pornography, of misogyny, etc. But there's also good porn, text, art, healthy porn, isn't it? We should make it better, healthier, and with more quality. In my opinion, that no one listens. Sex and porn, when it's healthy, it's about love and meditation, about kindness and trust. My question is, am I right? Does my love of this count as an addiction or not? And if I don't have any problems with this, is that kind of okay? The most negative thing in all that, people usually hate porn, and I'm sad when people hate such a good thing. So, for a long time, people have been debating about whether porn and masturbation are good or bad. And even sex, for that matter. Is it good or is it bad? And so we'll talk a lot about pornography addiction, right? So we'll say, like, some people will say, oh my God, I watch pornography too much. I'm addicted. Sometimes we'll also hear from people like significant others or parents, right? Where the significant other was like, I don't like it when my SO watches porn. My SO is addicted to porn. We'll get kind of complaints on that. Sometimes, you'll have parents who are concerned. So how do you know if something is a problem and if it isn't a problem? So that's kind of the first question here. The second thing is, like, what do we know about pornography, right? Or is there actually like science or data? Because they're sort of saying, there were a huge amount of papers that everyone masturbates and it's healthy. So what does the science kind of say now? Like, what's the conclusion? Have we kind of swung back towards addiction? Was there sort of this like body positivity and acceptance movement where, people were kind of talking about pornography as an evil, and then a bunch of research came out saying everyone jerks off or masturbates? And so, like, what's up with that? So let's talk about that for a second. And so then you also have people, like this who are sort of saying that pornography for me, sex for me is like about love. It's about kindness. It's about trust. We can elevate pornography to an art form, and it really can be artistic. It can be something that's amazing and like a human achievement that signals the progress of cultural, or cultural progression. And a true artiste, we can make fanfics that are not lolled at, but are actually like amazing works of art. So what's the deal? Like, what do we actually know about this stuff? So we're going to sort of go through a quick sort of history of pornography just based on my understanding of it, and specifically the relationship with research. And then we're also going to look at statistics today about, what do people say? Like, is pornography like healthy or unhealthy? What does the research show? What does it not show? Which is a big part of it. So the first thing is, let's talk a little bit about kind of the moralization of sex. I'm not an expert in this, right? So like my background is in science. So for a long time, though, we know that like sex became a dirty thing due to morality and religion for the most part. I mean, there's going to be some amount of, that's a overgeneralization. So for example, in the Hindu tradition, you have this thing called the Kam Sutra. So sutra is like a religious text, and Kam means desire, enjoyment, I guess, pleasure, maybe pleasure is the best word, desire or pleasure, something like that. And so it's sort of something that's regarded as a religious text, but it's like a manual about how to have sex, right? That's what the Kam Sutra is. And so in many cultures, like sex was okay, celebrated, etc. And then in some of the more Christian traditions, it started to get like kind of frowned upon. So you'll even have some of these extreme things. Like I remember the original reason for long tablecloths, I don't know if this is actually true or not, or if it's apocryphal, is that people were afraid, like some of the Quakers or someone, that may be a misattribution of, I don't mean to offend a Quaker, I just don't remember exactly who developed long tablecloths or the veracity of the story. But what I remember reading somewhere, I don't know if that makes it true, was that tablecloths were lengthened because the table legs would arouse lust. Right? So we can't see a table leg because that'll turn people on. And lust is a bad thing. It's one of the 7 deadly sins, right? So, we started to get sort of like negative moral associations with things like lust and masturbation and sex and stuff like that. And then it started becoming evil, right? And then people started feeling really guilty. I think we had a lot of problems with suppressed sexuality. And then papers started coming out, right? That like, okay, people actually started studying it. So instead of taking a moral perspective, we started to take a scientific perspective. Is sex healthy or unhealthy? Is masturbation normal or not normal? Is it, okay or not okay? And then we had a bunch of papers that sort of show that, okay, masturbation is like very common. It doesn't seem to kind of mess people up. Seems to be kind of okay. And then as the pornography industry evolved, right? So it started out with like photographs and magazines and then videos. And then we sort of like moved on to the internet. And now we've sort of seen like, much like other things on the internet, pornography is getting more intense, flashier, more colorful, more immersive, intense sounds, intense sights, like the sensory experience of pornography is just getting enhanced, right? So if you look at, for example, a black and white drawing of someone who's naked versus a black and white photograph, we've become a little bit more real and a little bit more engaging. And then we add color pornography. Then we add sort of like longitudinal pornography where you'll have like not just one isolated picture, but a series of pictures. And then we have video. And then we may have had silent video at some point, who knows, black and white video at some point. And then we have sound, right? And now we've got like 4K, and now we've got like intense colors, and now we've got, like surround sound, and now we have VR. And so what's happening is like pornography is getting more and more intensive. It's getting more and more vibrant. We're also getting to select a lot more. So pornography is becoming more and more specialized. And we're now also getting not just like the purely sensory component, but we're starting to get emotional components to pornography as well, right? So with the advent of some platforms where you can interact and commission particular kinds of pornography, and you can get someone who's creating pornography to interact with you, thank you directly. Like you can form some kind of pseudo relationship or even real relationship. I don't know exactly what it is. So now like it's getting more intense, right? And as it's getting more intense, we've seen, as this person kind of pointed out, a wave of publications talking about like problems with porn addiction. So people are struggling more. Erectile dysfunction and delayed ejaculation are on the rise for men under 40. So that's kind of like a concerning phenomenon that we've observed, and we'll kind of get into that. So generally speaking, we think about erectile dysfunction as a problem that's associated with age and other conditions like hypertension or obesity or things like that. But what we're starting to see is that there's appears to be a higher number of people who are like 25, 30, 35, who have difficulty ejaculating, maintaining erections, things like that. And so people have started to wonder, and as people have sort of also said, like, I'm addicted to pornography, it's negatively impacted relationships and stuff. People have wondered, okay, is pornography bad again? Are we putting it into that category? Okay. So now, like, what do we understand about this? Like, what's the verdict? Is pornography something that's okay? Is masturbation okay? Is it not okay? And the short answer is, much like anything else in reality that you want to look at scientifically, it's not binary, right? It's more complicated than that. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at what the research shows about what's the impact of pornography, like what's going on there, okay? So the first thing is we're going to go over some epidemiologic data. So masturbation. Oh, the Apple Pencil is dead. Oh my God. Okay, well, it looks like we're going to have to let that charge for a little while. How did that happen? Okay, it's charging for a second, so we'll just... Okay. Just use your fingers, so we can still talk about it. So that's okay. So we're just going to lecture like this today, okay? So the first thing to understand is that, like, people, through surveys, we know that about 76% of men watch pornography, and about 41 to 46% of women watch pornography, and that was 6 years ago. So a lot of people may say, like, that number is entirely too low for both genders. So we know also that that the rate of pornography consumption is increasing. So I guess that those numbers are even higher now. We also know that a lot of gender differences that used to exist seem to be shrinking very rapidly. So gender disparities in terms of some of these phenomenon, like pornography use, playing video games, for example, seem to be like shrinking very rapidly. Also, I'm noticing, like, there used to be like maybe a 2-to-1 ratio of women who experience anxiety due to epidemiologic data compared to men, whereas I personally think that number seems to be shrinking as well. So I think that we're seeing some trends of like gender disparities. I don't mean in terms of gender disparities is a bad thing. I mean, almost gender disparities is a good thing. Like, one gender was, experienced more of an addiction than the other gender. So what we're seeing is like this stuff seems to be shrinking. So pornography use, for example, like women are quote unquote catching up to men. I'm not saying that that's a good thing or a bad thing. That's just seems to be the direction that the data is going. So the first thing is, so a lot of people use it. And then what are the concerns that we have in terms of pornography use? So when people say that pornography is bad, what are the concerns that we have? So the first is something called an addiction. So how do you know if you have an addiction? And in psychiatry, when we look at diagnostic criteria for addiction, there's one major criteria that spans all of the addictions, which is impairment of function. So if your pornography use or masturbation or sexual behavior is causing problems in your life, then it is much more likely to like cross over into addiction. So if engaging in sexual behavior is negatively impacting your marriage, if engaging in sexual behavior is causing you to get, STIs, sexually transmitted infections, if like masturbating prevents you from going to work, or you get in trouble at work for masturbating. Like, those are the kinds of things that we really kind of think of in terms of an addiction. So when someone is addicted to something, they tend to have negative consequences in their life, but they're unable to stop and thus open themselves up to those negative consequences. And so I know everyone's memeing about masturbating at work. That's not a joke and it's not a meme. Like, that happens to people who are truly addicted. And for people who think like, lol, I'm addicted to pornography, like, you got to understand there are people out there who are truly addicted and fall into that problem. So another good example of this is something like, driving under the influence. Okay, so like this is where people who are addicted will drive under the influence. They'll get, their license taken away, and then they'll still continue driving because they can't help themselves, right? So they're someone who's so addicted to the substance that in spite of the negative consequences of using the substance, they continue using it, and it causes all kinds of problems. So we'll see that a lot in more substance use disorders, where people will empty their bank accounts, they'll get divorced, they'll lose their job, and all kinds of things, but they continue using. So if something is do you have a pornography addiction or not? Does it impair your function? Is like a really, really important thing. Second thing is that oftentimes people who are addicted to something can make attempts to cut back and fail to do so. So the other thing about addiction is it tends to control you instead of you controlling it. And if y'all are concerned about something like this is absolutely where you should go see a medical professional and try to figure out, first of all, do you have an addiction or not? And secondly, like, how to get help for it, because this is something that not everyone can overcome on their own, which is like perfectly fine. That's why we have addiction specialists, because we recognize that some people need help. Okay? So that's what an addiction is. Now, the other thing is that there are a number of different phenomenon that are arising that appear to be problematic and are correlated with pornography use. So that's just a fancy, stupid academic way of saying porn appears to be causing some problems. Masturbation appears to be causing some problems. And so what are the problems when we think about asking the question, is masturbation healthy or unhealthy? Let's step aside from addiction for a moment, but what is masturbation and pornography doing to our society? What are we seeing in terms of changes or trends? So the first thing that people talk a little bit about is erectile dysfunction and delayed ejaculation or problems with ejaculation. So that also tends to be, first of all, biased towards men, right? So most of the research on pornography and sex addiction, I think, has been focused on men. So you'll have studies, for example, that are done out of urology clinics because erectile dysfunction is what people present with. So that's kind of the first thing. Another thing that people will talk a little bit about is that like our reward circuitry is kind of getting all messed up. So people will say, I'm not able to be aroused by sexual intercourse. That may have something to do with the inability to ejaculate or reach climax, because something about the stimulation in the brain from pornography is like so much more vibrant in some ways than like real life, that like our receptors kind of get like out of whack. So there's like some concern that we're sort of shaping our brains in kind of an unhealthy way. There's also some concerns about real life sex becoming like boring or like not engageable. So this is something that confuses a lot of people, is we tend to romanticize, or even like, not even, I feel like some romanticize isn't really the right word. We tend to imagine sex as something that's like very intense and explosive and orgasmic, right? So if we watch pornography and our brain develops an idea of what sex is supposed to be like, when we end up having sex, like it turns out to be like somewhat disappointing, smelly, like confusing. And then people start questioning their sexuality, or they start wondering, am I asexual? Like all kinds of like problems arise. And so we're sort of shaping our expectations in sort of an unhealthy way. The third dimension that we're sort of thinking about in terms of what problems pornography and masturbation can cause are relationship problems. And so a lot of times it'll create problems in a relationship, right? So if you're not able to achieve climax with a partner, or if your partner feels kind of, unloved, or you have difficulties or has concerns about your pornography use, that can lead to problems. And so these are kind of the three things that we're going to talk about today. The first thing that we're going to talk a little bit about is sort of this like delayed ejaculation, erectile dysfunction, difficulty reaching climax. So this is where we have to be kind of careful with the research, because a lot of the research is correlative. So what they say is they'll look at like people who have erectile dysfunction, or they'll look at people who are unable to like achieve climax in a sexual relationship, and they will ask them, how much pornography do you use? And what they'll sort of find is this finding that people who watch more pornography have more difficulty achieving climax in sexual intercourse than people who don't. Now, this is where things get subtle but very tricky, because at this point, people oftentimes will conclude if you watch a bunch of porn, it's going to make it hard for you to have sex. But remember that cross-sectional studies or correlations are not causation. So this is where the flip side of this could be, if you have difficulty engaging in sex, you may reach more towards pornography, right? So it can go either way, actually. So like if my sexual relationship is unsatisfying, what effect do you think that will have on my pornography consumption? It'll probably increase, right? So this is where like a lot of times if we look at the way that people are interpreting the data, it's more subtle than I think people give it credit for, because everyone wants a simple answer. And oftentimes we have preconceived notions when we are looking at the data. So this person is going to be pro-pornography, so they may look at the data in a particular way, whereas other people, like if I'm in a relationship and my partner watches a bunch of pornography and we have an unfulfilling sex life, what do you think I'm going to do in terms of the interpretation of that data? I'm going to assume that the pornography is the problem and is causing this issue in our relationship, versus we have an issue in our relationship and pornography is actually like, it's not the problem, it's the antidote for that person, right? So there do seem to be clear correlations between increased pornography use, difficulty maintaining erections and erectile dysfunction, and problems with ejaculation and reaching climax. So that is something that like I've worked with people for, and I do believe that pornography has a causative effect there. That's personally the way I think the relationship goes, more likely. And part of that is just because of like physiologic conditioning. So for example, the actual physical experience of if you're a man masturbating with your hand, or if you're a woman, like, you know, using a vibrator or direct clitoral stimulation versus penetrative sex is like quite different, right? So the actual physiologic stimulation is like very different. There are different sensations. And so I think a large part of this is that if you sort of almost entrain your body to sexually climax in a particular way, and that kind of entraining is going to happen through pornography use and masturbation, it's going to be difficult to transition over to sex. It can be done, for sure. But it's the kind of thing that like there may actually be a causative component there. I personally think there is. Because I think just based on my understanding of physiology, I think it's exceedingly strange for men under the age of 40 to have erectile dysfunction. That's not an indictment. It just means that something serious is going on that's creating this effect, and that's what has to be dealt with. And so first thing is that there does appear to be a correlation between pornography and masturbation usage and things like erectile dysfunction, delayed ejaculation, and like inability to perform sexually. Second thing that we're going to talk about is reward stimulation circuitry in the brain. So this is where, you know, people have figured out that more sensory input is like better at engaging humans. So if you look at like a sale sign, if the sign is bigger, if it's more brightly colored, it's more likely to engage you. So you'll kind of see this with like advertisements and stuff like that, where like, I don't know if you guys have ever experienced this, it's friggin' annoying, where like, you know, the volume of a TV show will be here and then the ad will be like 30% louder. And it's just really inconvenient, but it shocks you into paying attention. So human beings have figured out how to engage the human brain. And so if you look at apps, right? Apps are like beautiful. They're not like grayscale. They're like, you know, they have all these buttons and like little bits of motion, and like, you guys know, like, you know, even these things like Candy Crush and Jelly Splash and stuff like that, they're like jiggly. You know what I mean? They're like, you know, it's kind of weird. Like, so people have figured out that if you add like a little bit of jiggliness to an app, it increases the amount of like engagement. You'll even see this with sort of like the chibi kind of like artwork, right? There's something like cute and engaging about round figures that are a little bit more colorful and stuff like that, right? You guys get that? So people have sort of figured out that there's real life, and our brains have learned to adapt to particular kinds of things, right? So if you look at like, bird mating, and you look at peacocks. So like peacocks will have this very vibrant, colorful thing, which like engages male peacocks will like spread their feathers out and they'll dance. And it's like a show that's like very bright and colorful and like sensorially engaging, right? And human beings like peacocks too. Like, why do we like peacocks? Because they're bright and colorful. And so the brain likes that kind of stuff. So I think what's happening in pornography, and you get other weird kinds of like fringe or niche pornography that engages our brain in like more and more profound ways that actually separates a little bit from reality. Right? Because even if you look at sex, like it's a little bit jiggly, right? That's part of the enjoyment of it. And so what people are, I think what's going on with pornography is we're seeing like more and more like niche pornography. We're seeing more sensorily engaging pornography, brighter sounds, sharper resolution, like more engagement, more people involved in the scene. Like there's just an evolution people are sort of figuring out, because remember that pornography is a competition for the producers, right? Everyone is competing for you to watch their pornography. And so what they tend to do is like amp things up. And as they amp things up, this is the other thing that we're sort of seeing in pornography usage, especially with problematic usage, is that what used to sexually excite you like doesn't work anymore. So your brain needs like harder and harder stuff to like get you excited. And so we're seeing like more niche pornography. We're seeing more hardcore pornography. We're seeing stuff that's like bizarrely addictive because it kind of tricks your brain into thinking certain things. It's hard to describe. I'm not going to go into detail, but there's evolutions of pornography. So I do think that there's definitely like a neuroscientific exploitive component going on with the evolution of pornography, which I don't think is healthy. So as we get more and more artificially stimulated through more vibrant pornography, I think it makes it harder to engage in sexual relationships that are more natural, right? And we sort of see this not just in pornography, we see it with like chicken nuggets, right? And tendies, where it's like what's happening is we're figuring out as a society how to optimize the experience of like eating chicken. And as we batter it, as we fry it, as we do this, as we do that, it becomes more and more tasty. So we figured out our natural taste buds, our natural like, insulin receptors and things like that. We figured out like how to capitalize on what our body likes. And people will make specific products for it that sort of take advantage of those receptors. And then people will end up eating like 2,000 calories in a meal because it tastes so damn good. And then over time, what that ends up doing is being actually probably bad for us, right? And so I think we're seeing a similar thing in pornography. It's just something that as we're figuring out what works in the brain, people who produce things and are trying to sell you stuff will move in that direction, okay? So we're seeing that. Next thing is dissatisfaction with partners. So this is where the other challenge that we tend to find is that a lot of times pornography and masturbation will create interpersonal difficulties. So in some instances, like we've talked about, it's difficult to have sex with a partner because of all of the above stuff, right? So maybe because like your brain, like you've been overshaped by pornographic interactions, your physiology has been conditioned to climax in a particular situation. So you can't sort of do that with a partner. That's actually increasingly common, but there are all kinds of other things as well. Where, remember, the other thing that we said is that it's not necessarily one directional, where maybe a dissatisfactory sex life leads to more pornography consumption, more masturbation, etc., right? So that I think makes perfect sense as well. So this is where if you have a problem with pornography in your relationship, I think the most important thing there is like communication. So that's where like communicating your thoughts, where a lot of times what people will do is they'll come to a conclusion and push for a behavioral change. So they'll say, the reason we're not having a good sex life, or it really bothers me that you're watching pornography, I want you to stop. So I'll see this a lot. I'm going to sort of assume a female person complaining and a male person is the pornography consumer here. It doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but that's more of clinically what I've seen, where a lot of times issues of things like self-esteem and personal like concerns that someone may have about their own body image or their comfort in their body, which kind of makes sense, right? So if you're a normal human and your partner is watching pornography of artificial humans, right, who have different kinds of cosmetic surgery and makeup and all this other kinds of stuff, like it can encourage insecurity, right? Because this is like an artificially perfect person. And the artificially perfect person, by the way, doesn't get older, right? Because like as pornographic actors and actresses, generally speaking, as they age, newer, younger people come in. And so like the constant diet of pornography is going to be like consuming a particular age range. And then you as a human being can't compete with that because you can't stay forever youthful. So there are all kinds of like internal challenges in terms of relationships, self-esteem that pornography can create. Is it a dissatisfying sex life that's leading to pornography usage? Is it pornography that's leading to a dissatisfied sex life? The short answer is that it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of solution, and a conversation is really, really important, right? Or multiple conversations. Sharing your concerns, trying to understand where your partner is coming from, trying to understand why they watch pornography, what it does for them, and trying to come together to sort of figure out like what's an acceptable middle ground. Generally speaking, I'm not a huge fan of ultimatums. But this is also where sometimes if you really have an addictive problem where someone, it's really negatively impacting your relationship, those consequences need to be shared in a very severe way if there are severe problems. So I think communication is a huge part in trying to figure out, how to like navigate that. So the good news is that I've had a lot of success helping couples like arrive at some kind of healthy medium. And some of that, if you guys have seen the video on death grip syndrome, like there are things like that where you can physiologically recondition your body to enjoy sexual experience more. And that just involves, certain steps, which we're not going to go into now. So those are all valid concerns. So the last thing that I want to share with y'all is, so if we sort of ask the question, is pornography a problem? Is masturbation a problem? So I'll leave y'all with the simple statistic, okay, which I think sort of settles it. It doesn't settle it, but really helps me understand it or organize it in my mind, which is that researchers did a study where they asked 820 men. Once again, this is on men, right? So that there's a huge bias. There are lots of biases in the literature where we just study men a lot more than women with respect to this. So there's a lot of further research needed. But people asked men like what, they just tried to figure out like which camp do these people fall into. So sure, Dr. K is saying it could be a problem here, it could be a problem here, it could be a problem here. What are the odds though? And so what they found is that 76% of men are what they call recreational pornography users. So what that means is they watch pornography, they tend to enjoy pornography. It doesn't seem to be associated with really many negative consequences at all. There's no erectile dysfunction, there are really no relationship problems or things like that. Generally speaking, for 76% of people, it's fine. So for 13% of people, they are what they call highly distressed but non-compulsive pornography or masturbation users. So these are people who may not have a pornography addiction per se, so there isn't compulsive use, but there's like negative stuff going on in their lives potentially associated with the pornography. So they're not addicted to porn, but they may have relationship problems. They may have a lot of like avoidance in life. They may have some amount of like delayed ejaculation or things like that. And about 11% of people are compulsive pornography users. And so that's kind of shocking, right? So like I think that's a pretty high number. So what we're sort of looking at is that 11% of people may have been closer to like addicted to pornography, which is a shockingly high number. So just to give y'all, it's 11.8%. Just to give y'all some context, so alcohol addiction is generally speaking considered on the more prevalent side, right? So we have the most alcoholics, and alcohol addiction is around 6%. So this is also where what we're seeing is an alarming rate of technology-related addictions. So video game addiction is probably above 10% now. In some countries, some studies show rates of 20 to 26%, right? So 1 out of 4 people could be addicted to like video games. And so 11% of compulsive pornography, 11.8%, almost 12%, is incredibly high. So when it kind of comes down to it, if you were to ask the question statistically, is my masturbation and pornography use a problem? I'd say there's a 75% chance that you're fine. But there's also a 25% chance that it is a problem. And if it is a problem for you, I strongly encourage y'all to get help, get support. Go get evaluated by a professional, and see if you kind of fall into that category. Because the good news is that there's like stuff you can do about all of this, right? We've talked about some of this stuff on stream, so we're not going to go into it right here. But there are ways to retrain your physiology. There are ways to kind of like rewire your dopaminergic circuits when it comes to the consumption of pornography. I think the abstinence of particular kinds of pornography can also be very, very helpful. So if you're into some of like the really hardcore stuff, and like that's just what triggers your brain, right? Because that's what your brain needs. It develops a tolerance to a particular stimulus. And in order to like get equally excited, you need a higher dose of something. So this is how people overdose on drugs, because it used to be that taking like, a third of a gram of heroin was enough, and then you need half a gram, and then you take a gram, and then you take 2 grams, and then you take 3 grams, because you need more and more of the stuff to get high. And so we're seeing the same thing with pornography, so sort of like scaling back on some of that stuff can also be effective. So at the end of the day, is pornography or masturbation a good thing or a bad thing? I'd say like, it depends. And chances are that the odds are in favor of it not being that big of a deal, and is probably like a healthy thing to do for most people. But what we are seeing is both an increase, I would suspect, in pornography usage, problematic pornography usage. 11.8% of compulsive usage is very high. 13% of people getting some kind of negative consequence is also high. And that number seems to be growing as technology improves, and is like pornography producers are figuring out how to like get you in more. And the more we sort of go down that rabbit hole, the harder it becomes for us to sort of engage in healthy relationships. Questions? So someone's asking, every time I watch porn, I feel emotionally numb, disoriented, tired, and hopeless for a few hours, which drives me more to it. Is this okay? I don't know if y'all have seen our streams with the pornography addicts, but I think that a lot of the pornography addiction, just like other addictions, is used as a form of almost self-medication, right? So like what we find is that people who will consume more pornography and masturbate more, they almost use it as like an emotional relief, because it does kind of numb you out. What was the sample size of which study? I've cited like 15 studies today. If you guys want, this is a okay review. It's not the best review, but there's a review that sort of goes through it historically. I think some of the conclusions in the review are a little bit not ideal. And furthermore, some of the papers that they cite, I think, draw some inappropriate conclusions. But I think it's like a good kind of narrative review. Yeah, so do you think ACT would be a good behavioral therapy for porn addiction? Absolutely. So ACT is a strong evidence-based treatment. Acceptance and commitment therapy is strong evidence-based treatment, especially for addictions. So you can find the study with 820 men it's one of the references for the review that I linked. 860, whatever. Can you teach a non-Kundalini meditation for porn addiction? I'd have to think about that. Yeah, so there's a question, what do you think about watching it since a young age? So this is kind of interesting. So men tend to have their first exposure to pornography use around 13. Women tend to have it around 16. So we know that women start consuming pornography on average later than men do. We also find, so I highly, highly recommend y'all check out the porn addiction interview on our YouTube channel. But what we tend to find is that the earlier the exposure to pornography, the more likely you are to have problems. So for some of the people on that porn addiction stream, for example, they started watching pornography or were exposed to pornography at like 9. And so I think there's something to be said of early exposure creating a greater likelihood of forming an addiction, which is not just true of pornography. So we know that the earlier you start using a substance, the more likely you are to get addicted to it. So if you start drinking at 13 or start using marijuana at 13, you're more likely to get addicted to marijuana or alcohol than if you start using it at like 19. Right? Okay. Let's go ahead and move on, I think. That lasted longer. I was hoping to get through that pretty quickly, but it's interesting. Okay. Let's see how. Oh, great. I think there was maybe some problem because it looks like we're fully charged. Okay. So let's move on. Oh, wrong thing. GG. Leaked chat. Okay. So, I have a tough time handling rejection. Hey everyone. I could really use some advice about how to get rid of this rejection sensitivity I'm having. The most small sign of rejection makes me feel absolutely miserable. I get insecure and feel hurt at first, and then angry at the person that I feel rejected by. There were many times where it left me miserable for days or even weeks. Now it happens more often that I sometimes react openly to it by being a bit off or being a bit colder just to regret it a few minutes later because it just turned out to be in my head. This is really getting in the way of making friends or finding some at least, but I can't shut my emotions off in that moment. I'm 22 and shouldn't be such a child anymore. Does anyone on here know how to get rid of this? So this is something that a lot of people struggle with. That we have a difficult time handling rejection, right? And what we're looking for is a way to get rid of it. So this is where, a lot of people will say, you just handling rejection is about developing thick skin, right? So even we'll say that. We'll say it's about practice. It's about experience. You got to get rejected over and over and over again, survive it, and then you'll realize that, it's not that bad, right? And that's how you get over handling rejection. You just have to be rejected, which there's truth to. But if you really think about it, it's terrifying, right? So if you tell someone, the way to get over your phobia of snakes is to spend more time with snakes. That's the reason that we have exposure therapy in psychiatry. We're let's expose you to it. The only way to learn how to handle getting rejected is to get rejected. Which is maybe true, right? But it's actually terrifying if you really think about it. It's really, really terrifying. Because these people don't want to do that. It's if you have someone who's afraid of snakes and you're the solution to get over your fears, we're going to drop you in a pit of snakes. They're not going to want to do that. If you have trouble with rejection and you're sensitive to rejection, you have trouble handling it, you're not going to sign up for it, right? In fact, that's not a personal failing, which, by the way, a lot of people feel like they have, right? There's a lot of self-judgment here. So you're almost rejecting yourself in this process. Oh, I'm such an idiot for being so sensitive to rejection. I should have grown up by now. Which in that moment, what are you doing to yourself? You're rejecting yourself. You're not accepting yourself. You're not cutting yourself any slack. And so this is sort of where it honestly starts, right? So why are we so sensitive to rejection? Generally speaking, as human beings, the things that we're sensitive to are the things that we ourselves are insecure about or the things that we do to ourselves. If I am afraid I'm ugly, if I'm afraid that I'm overweight, what am I going to be sensitive to? Comments that other people make about me potentially being ugly or being overweight. And sometimes what'll even happen is they're not even making comments about my weight, right? But the way that my mind is so primed, it's going to assume that a neutral comment is going to be interpreted as a comment about what I'm sensitive to. So rejection sensitivity is really common, and people are always trying to get rid of it. And the standard answer is get rejected over and over and over again. And that's by standard answer. We're not saying it's wrong. There's a certain truth to it, right? Because once you get rejected a couple times and you survive, then you'll realize like, oh, it's actually like not that bad, or it won't devastate me the way that I thought it would. But that's not easy to engage in, and it's not sometimes helpful, right? So it's not like go out there and get rejected 1,000 times, and then you'll overcome your rejection sensitivity. Whereas if we think about it, each of those rejections is associated with a lot of pain, right? It hurts. Like you can't just ask someone to go outside and go swimming in lava every day for like a week. Like they're not going to do that, right? It's really hard. So how can we understand this a little bit better, and how can we sort of potentially get some control over it? Okay, so let's talk about this, okay? So how do we overcome rejection sensitivity? Okay. So the first thing to understand is that oftentimes the rejection sensitivity, the sensitivity itself, comes from self-perception, right? And we kind of saw that over here. We look at this like, I shouldn't be such a child anymore, right? So like we'll see that oftentimes. So the first thing that you can do is on a core level, like try to understand, where did you get the idea that you were worthy of rejection? Because if you're sensitive to something, chances are it's a fear that you hold internally. Right? Like, so what I would kind of ask yourself is, why are you rejectable? And as long as you have the belief that you are rejectable, it's going to be easy to be rejection sensitive, right? So this is actually like the foundation of it. So this is where if you do something like see a therapist or like work on your samskars or things like that. So a lot of like spiritual practices and stuff, you'll discover this kind of thing, right? As we like meditate and do this kind of stuff. You can do it sort of clinically or non-clinically. If you've got a serious problem and you have social anxiety or like real problems with your relationships, I'd recommend a clinician. But you can do this kind of internal work without necessarily going to therapy. Okay? So that's the first thing, is like understand the core of your sensitivity. And if you can work on that core of sensitivity by exploring, when did your brain learn that you were rejectable? And then as you think about those experiences, as you really process and you realize that chances are the reason you're rejection sensitive today is because there was someone who rejected you super hardcore and hurt so much, and you carry that hurt around with you. And you're so afraid of that happening again that like, it's kind of projecting into your current life, okay? Second thing is that when people are rejection sensitive, what they want to do is get rid of it, right? We want this thing to just go away. And so this, in a sense, is one way of getting rid of it. But like the goal here is to, how can I say this? The goal here is to change our reaction or change our mind. Whereas what we're going to share with you today is a couple of things that you can do that may actually help with this, okay? A couple of other things that you can do. The next thing to think a little bit about is when we sort of talk about other ways to get rid of it, there's sort of the thick skin approach, right? Which is if you get rejected enough, you'll get thick skin, and then it won't hurt as much, hurt less, right? But this is the kind of thing that's like absolutely terrifying, because I want y'all to understand this. So if you have a person who's rejection sensitive and you tell them to like get rejected and this hurts, like this is the whole point that you're trying to avoid. This is why you want to get rid of it, right? You're trying to avoid this at all costs. You want to be cured of the rejection sensitivity. So everything that your mind is doing in terms of even this kind of stuff. So when we get rejected, we feel hurt. So what do we do if we get rejected? Right? So sometimes we internalize it. For weeks, I feel hurt on the inside, but I'm not going to say anything to anyone for weeks. So like when we get rejected, we just take that feeling, we stuff it down in there, we live with it. It ruins our life for days or weeks. And you're telling this person to go out there and get rejected? They're going to get rejected once. They're going to go for days or weeks feeling bad about themselves. And then you're going to be like, good job. Now go out there and do it again. Or what happens is that, and then what happens is they get fed up with dealing with it internally. And then what do they start doing? They start lashing out. They get cold. Right? This is what this person said. Now it happens more often that I sometimes react openly by being a bit off or being a bit colder. So what's going on there? It's like, here's our bucket of bad feelings. And so why are we, and it's filling up with the toxicity of I got rejected, rejected, and then at some point it starts overflowing. And so now we start, sometimes we'll lash out, but what's more common is we'll start acting cold, right? And why do we do that? It's because like it's kind of passive aggressive, because we can't actually lash out. Like we can't like overtly get mad at them, but we're going to punish them for hurting us. So I'm going to give this person the cold shoulder. And then what happens then is like this screws up our relationships. Because on the one hand, like here's this person that could be my friend that makes me feel hurt for weeks. And then I give them the cold shoulder and I don't really understand like what is going, like they don't understand what's going on. I feel hurt by them. And so now like they're asking me, hey, do you want to go grab dinner sometime? And you're like, I don't know, maybe. And then the friend is confused because they don't understand what's going on. And there's all this rich internal stuff that's going on within me when I get rejected, which they have no idea about. And so then it gets confusing for them. They stop texting me. They get frustrated. That feels like another rejection. And then like this whole cycle repeats again. Right? So what can you do here? So I do think that there's value in all of these things, but there are two other things that I'm going to show y'all that are kind of like really important. One is perception, and the second is communication. So the key thing here that a lot of people miss out on rejection sensitivity is how their perception is screwing them. So let's look at this, and we can see it right here. The most small sign of rejection makes me feel absolutely miserable. This is the key thing. So a lot of times when we talk about growing internally or growing psychologically, we're always trying to control our reactions, or we're trying to control our internal environment, or we're trying to control our actions. Right? So if we think about like if someone has a problem, okay, there's signal, reaction, and action. And if you look at what people are asking for and where solutions are, right, it'll always be here and here. And we're missing a third of it. So let me give you all an example. So how do I get rid of this feeling? How do I overcome my social anxiety? How do I stop thinking about this? How do I not get hung up on that, right? How do I let go of an ex? How do I get over this relationship? How do I stop thinking about her all the time? Thinking about him all the time? How do I stand up for myself? How do I set boundaries? Right? How do I speak up for myself? How do I talk to my parents? So everyone's talking about the reaction and the action. How do I stop feeling this way? I want a magic bullet or magic wand that takes away the reaction. I want to shape my behavior. And so there are solutions there for sure. Here's what we're missing: the perception. Because if you can alter your perception, that'll change your reaction, and by definition, it'll change your action, right? Because the action is based on the reaction in turn is based on the perception. So the one area that I think is very, very, very underutilized in terms of self-growth is being critical and shaping your perceptions. So let's think about this a little bit more carefully. So the most small sign of rejection makes me feel absolutely miserable. Now, imagine you're in a relationship with this person. How can you interact with them? How can you avoid this? Right? If I'm your friend, and we'll see this like sometimes with these like horror texts, right, of dating apps and things like that, where like the smallest sign of rejection makes you feel miserable, but it's like, it's not actually a sign of rejection. They're not actually rejecting you. It's just life, right? So if I don't text you back within 5 minutes, you feel rejected. Your perception is, oh, this person is on the cusp of rejecting me. And let's understand why this is. This isn't stupid. It's because I don't know how to. So when we get rejected, and it hurts a lot, okay? So when we get rejected and we get weeks of misery, what is our brain going to adapt to do? It's going to learn how to like predict this as easily as possible, right? So if something is like, like we've seen this in, for example, parents of children who have had serious accidents, where like if you have a serious accident, if your child has a serious accident, and you take him to the hospital, the first sign of that thing repeating triggers the parent. And that's absolutely adaptive. It's absolutely evolutionary. We're not going to let it get to that point ever again. I've seen it in marriages where there's a lack of, the people have had affairs. And then what happens to the person who is cheated on? They're paranoid. And the first sign of infidelity creates an explosion of reaction. Y'all get that? So it's not like this person is stupid for a small sign creating a reaction. It's because if there's a bad consequence and it happens once, our brain is going to learn how to predict it. If it happens again, we're going to learn how to predict it. If it happens again, we're going to learn how to predict it. And then eventually what happens is like, the signal over here is small. The signal over here is larger. The signal over here is larger, right? And so smaller and smaller things are going to cause us to react, which is just our brain's way of protecting us. It's like, there's rain clouds in the sky. There's thunderstorms. There's rain clouds. There's regular clouds. And there's the beginning of clouds. There's a change in barometric pressure. Our brains and our survival mechanisms have learned how to move earlier and earlier and earlier and detect smaller and smaller signs. And the more the emotional impact is, the smaller the signs that we're going to look for. So what can you do? Recognize that this is what your brain is designed to do, but that it is a maladaptation. So what you really need to control is your perception. The key moment is here that you can work on. So if you have someone where the smallest sign of rejection, that's where you need to catch your mind. You need to say, hold on a second. What actually happened? And because once you jump on that conclusion, once you board the train of rejection, you're SOL. You're screwed. So how do you avoid boarding that train? How do you avoid getting the reaction and then engaging in the action? How do you avoid that, right? So this line and then this line. The way is by noticing the perception. This is the key thing. So what are you perceiving? What actually happened? How are you interpreting it that way? These are the questions that you need to ask yourself. And start with the smallest thing possible. Right? So if someone doesn't text you back, rather than like, oh my God, I'm getting rejected, and like texting them back like, oh, like, why aren't you texting me? Text me back, text me back, text me back. I'm so mad at you. Or then what happens is you adopt the cold shoulder, right? So then when they text you, you in your mind are like, they made me wait. I'm going to make them wait. And you resolve to yourself that whatever they text me, I'm going to not respond to them for 24 hours. That'll teach them. Because that's what's going on, right? And that doesn't help your relationship. So notice the perception. Why is this interpreting it this way? Right? Like, what are the other possibilities here? So this is where cognitive reframing comes up. So like, go through a differential diagnosis for what you perceive as a rejection. Ask yourself, why does my mind perceive this as a rejection? And it's going to be really hard because you're going to automatically jump to that conclusion. But look at the actual thing, like write it down. Like, what did they do? And how do I feel? And this is where the second antidote to this is communication. So this is where, like, communication isn't perfect, right? So if I don't text you back, there could be 1,000 reasons for that. And anytime there's a disconnect between two people, communicating like resolves that perceptual problem. So if you didn't text me good night, like every night, I feel really hurt by that. I feel rejected by that. But I never understood that you don't really like get any value out of that, right? So like it doesn't really mean much to you when I text you good night. It's not that important to me. Because human beings are all going to be operating off of their internal like roadmap of what's okay and what's not okay, what's important and what's not important. Because what's important to you may not be what's important to them. And so how do you resolve that perceptual gap? Because here's the problem, is you're judging their actions based on your internal roadmap, which is why a small signal makes you feel so rejected, whereas they're completely oblivious to it because it's not that big of a deal to them. And it's not that you're stupid for it being a big deal to you or they're stupid for not understanding. There isn't a right or wrong here. The key thing here is communication. Now, the tricky thing here is that people who are rejection sensitive are terrified of communication. And this is the last thing that I'll kind of leave you with. If you're sensitive to rejection, sometimes communication can be absolutely terrifying. Because these techniques like the cold shoulder, these passive-aggressive kind of moves, preserve some degree of safety. They preserve like some amount of like nebulousness into which you can't truly get rejected. And so sometimes if you're rejection sensitive, having a conversation is opening yourself up to the biggest possible rejection. Because if I tell them that texting every night is really important to me and it matters a lot to me, and then they don't do it, then it's a rejection of the highest order because I've explained to them how important it is. Right? So it can be terrifying to try to have communication, but I'd say if you're sensitive to rejection, sure, you can deal with the core of it. You can sort of try to make your reaction go away. You can start to adjust your actions. Yeah, vroom, right? But at the end of the day, what you got to be super, super, super careful about is your perception. This is the thing that is missed the most. Because it is in your perception that the whole cycle starts. So y'all got to be super careful about that. Okay? Questions? No, baby elephantism is next. Are such signals types of trauma? Sort of, right? So this is where, so trauma shapes our perceptions and shapes our behaviors. But trauma is not the exclusive thing that shapes our perceptions and shapes our behaviors, right? Trauma is a particular event that shapes our perceptions and behaviors in a particular way. So I would say that people who are rejection sensitive have probably undergone some kind of trauma, but I don't know if it's like, it's a word that gets thrown around a lot, right? So like sort of is the answer. How to be more mindful of perception? The first thing is to look for it. The first thing is when you react, pause and track back. Because here's the thing, if you're rejection sensitive, you really want to look at how you feel in the moment and you really want to look at all of the stuff you're going to do. I'm going to be cold to them. I'm not going to respond to them. I'm going to show them. I feel hurt. I can't believe they did this. And then your mind like boards this train and it's like thinking about the future and thinking about how you feel and thinking about how hurt you feel. What caused the rejection or the source of the rejection gets, you just blow right past that, man. So go back and say, hold on a second. What made me feel this way and what did they actually do? Because if you can alter your perception, then it changes the reaction and then it changes how you act. The perception is key. Because oftentimes with rejection sensitivity, we are sensitive. What does the word sensitive mean? It means that a small signal creates a large response. My skin is sensitive. Don't touch it there. I'm really sensitive about my weight. Don't talk about my weight. Right? So that the word sensitivity literally means disproportionate reaction to a small signal. And so focus on the signal. That's where you can start to shape your reaction to the signal. Because once the reaction happens, then it's really hard to manage. So it's the thing that people leave out. And by all means, like, get rejected. I mean, the more you get rejected, we'll see this a lot with dating, for example, right? You got to put yourself out there a couple times to realize that you'll survive a rejection. Okay? Giga Chad, get rejected. Yeah, so that's hard for people who are rejection sensitive, right? It's really easy for people who have the confidence to be rejected to tell people who don't have the confidence to be rejected, just go get rejected. So for people saying just change your perception. So the first thing is recognize that perception is part of the equation. And then explore it. You'll be surprised at how low-hanging the fruit is. Yeah, does rejection sensitivity have roots sometimes in a lack of validation from an early age? Absolutely. It oftentimes has, because your brain learned to be wary of rejection somehow. Do y'all get that? Like, it learned that lesson that rejection is dangerous. Rejection hurts. And so it had to learn that lesson somewhere. Yeah, so notice the perception and challenge your beliefs. That's a great way to put it. We're not saying that you have to explicitly just challenge them, right? Because right now, you just taken them for granted. There's no scrutiny. And that's where, like, you'll be surprised at how far a little scrutiny goes. Is becoming the observer, like in meditation, a good way to get a new perspective? 100%, yes. So as we become the observer, we separate ourselves from the reaction, and therefore the reaction dies down. Right? So I think there's a video in Dr. K's Guide to Meditation about how we fuse with our thoughts and how it is that meditation is a scientifically validated intervention for all mental illnesses. I think that's fair. Maybe not all, but, a surprising majority of them. So it helps for borderline personality disorder, helps for depression, helps for anxiety, helps for ADHD. So how does that work? It's because on a fundamental level, meditation helps you pull away from your mind and be more objective. And the common thing about all these mental illnesses is that we get caught up in our mind. So there's some videos in there about the nature of thought and, like, how does thought work and how does mind work and how do we separate from our mind and what happens when we separate from our mind. Okay? Yeah, so someone's saying, I had an anxiety attack yesterday because of rejection, and doing the observer thing suddenly calmed me down. It was insane. Absolutely. So what about if you have trauma and the meditation triggers it? So I recommend particular meditation techniques for people with trauma. So here's the thing to remember about trauma and meditation. When we have trauma, our mind develops suppressing mechanisms or protective mechanisms where we wall the trauma off. Oftentimes when we meditate, especially from the mindfulness tradition, and let's remember that mindfulness is like 5% of, like, the meditative tradition. The problem is that it's become the most popular, so everyone assumes that mindfulness is meditation. So mindfulness is about observing and letting go and pulling back. And so when you create that kind of vacuum, sometimes the trauma gets sucked past the defense mechanisms, and that negative pressure in the mind, that vacuum in the mind, pulls the trauma up. So that's why if you look at clinical interventions, meditative interventions, they tend to be more grounding in nature. So they're not going to create a vacuum in the mind. In fact, the opposite. So if you look at mindfulness practices in DBT, they call them mindfulness practices, but they're really grounding meditations. They're really focusing your mind in a particular place. It's the opposite of a vacuum. And so if you have trouble with trauma and mindfulness, that's where I'd say, find a competent teacher who is, like, trauma informed and can teach you an appropriate meditation for trauma. Is there a difference between Buddhist and Hindu meditation? Sure. But that assumes that Buddhist and Hindu meditation are also monolithic, which they're not. Right? So Buddhism has tons of traditions of meditation with lots of different techniques. Hinduism has the same. But generally speaking, I'd say that there's more overlap between the traditions than within the traditions. So there's Tantric Buddhism and there's Tantric Hinduism, which are basically very similar. So the difference between Vajrayana Buddhism and like Mahayana Buddhism is greater than the difference between Hindu and Buddhist meditation. Essentially, Buddhist meditation is Hindu meditation. It's all the same tradition, which I know sometimes will like offend people. But let's remember that the techniques that Buddha taught and the techniques that Buddha learned were from quote unquote Hindu teachers, right? Like they're all the same. The techniques are the same. So it's, I'm not saying that they're exactly the same. Like Buddha's teachings were pretty consistent with Hindu teachings, but that's where like Hinduism is like a very diverse religion, as is Buddhism. And then what's happened is both traditions have continued to evolve, and as they continue to evolve, they differentiate out, right? So just like evolution, like there's Latin, and then like the further down you go, you end up with French, you end up with Spanish, you end up with Portuguese. But the core of it is like Latin. Okay. Let's talk about, okay, we've got an option. We can do hyper independence, or we can do baby elephant syndrome. What do y'all want to do? Okay, there's this kind of baby, okay, let's do it. Alrighty. Okay.
So here's a question. Do you have baby elephant syndrome? So baby elephant syndrome comes from an old story about somebody who came to a circus and realized that, there's a big, powerful elephant who was chained to this tiny little rope connected to this little pole. And he asked the circus ringmaster and says, hey, why is the elephant just tied to that? Doesn't an elephant know that he can just like very easily break free and just run away? And the ringmaster says, well, as a matter of fact, this is how we do it. When we bring in a small baby elephant, we chain them up to a much thicker rope, to a much thicker pole. And, they'll pull and they'll try to get away. And as a result, when they can't break away, they come to realize, oh, I can't break away. So as they grow up, they stop pulling. They stop trying because they learned that, okay, this rope is unbreakable. So even as they grow up and they change that rope to a thinner rope, or sometimes maybe not even a rope at all, the elephant doesn't keep trying. And when we experience baby elephant syndrome, it's oftentimes that, when we were growing up, our parents or our environment, our teachers, our friends may have told us something about ourselves that we took deep to heart. You're not good enough. You're not smart enough. You're ugly. You're short. You're whatever it is, that we take on these beliefs. And we never come to challenge those stories. In fact, we just kind of accept it as we go on. And we go through the rest of our lives thinking that's who we are. But we never come to take a look at that. We never challenge and reflect and say, is this true? And as a matter of fact, sometimes the most powerful, smartest, most incredible people I've met in those specific fields are the people who believe they're the worst, because they're the ones who've worked most at it. Some of the best writers I've met believe that they are genuinely terrible writers, because at some point they met a terrible teacher who said, you're a bad writer, you're never going to be a good enough writer, and they kept practicing and practicing and practicing anyway. And those are the lucky ones, because the unlucky ones, they stop trying, and they bury their talents, they bury their creativity, they bury their wisdom, and they never come back to take a look at it. So challenge your own beliefs, because otherwise you're nothing but a baby elephant stuck in the body of a grown adult. So here's a question.
So this is really interesting, right? So let's talk about this. So there's some things I really love about this, and some things that I think kind of concern me about the self-help TikTok generation. So I like to kind of just share some thoughts about this. So the first is that this is a story that doesn't start with circus elephants. It actually starts in meditative traditions. Okay, so this is a story that's been told like by, monks in India and China and stuff, for probably India, because that's where elephants were, for thousands of years. And it illustrates the point that this person is saying, which is that oftentimes when we're growing up, we form a particular belief. And then as we grow older, we don't challenge that belief and it starts to restrict us. And so the general sentiment, I think the story is, largely shares the point that's correct. And the sentiment is to like challenge your conceptions. Okay. So both of those things I think are fantastic. There are a couple of things that I sort of have issue with. The first is calling this a syndrome. So I know this sounds kind of weird, but like what a syndrome is, and we'll talk a little bit about whether using language precisely is good or bad. So syndrome is a constellation of symptoms that people share, that people share, right? So it's like a group of things that we group together. And then the cool thing about the syndrome is that once we recognize what a syndrome is, so major depressive disorder is a syndrome, ADHD is a syndrome, it's a constellation of things that go together. And when we call something a syndrome, the reason that's useful is if we can lump these things together and it's a pattern that lots of different people can relate to, then we can study this group of people because we're putting these people together because they share a constellation of symptoms. And then we can understand how can we help this group of people, okay? So in the case of like ADHD, what we'll see is that there's impulsivity. There's a lack of attention. There is difficulty like adhering to stimuli or changing your attention. There is perseveration, so hyper-focus on a particular thing, or the inability to focus. And so as we start to look at all of these features, the more features we add, the more specific we can get, the more we can group these people together. And if we group these people together and we study them together, we can figure out what works for these kinds of people. And so when you call this a syndrome, I'm curious, what are the features of the syndrome? How do you know if you have the syndrome? Right? So like this is my problem with calling it a syndrome is like, how do you know which beliefs you should challenge? Which beliefs make it baby elephant syndrome? Right? Is it a lack of, what are the beliefs of baby elephant syndrome? Like on a piece of paper, like how do you know if you have baby elephant syndrome? So there's something that a lot of value here, but this is why I think precision of language is important. Because like, how do you know if you have this? So a lot of people will watch stuff like this, and I think this is what happens, is that we'll put labels on things that sound really good, but are relatively imprecise. And when someone watches something like this, they'll resonate with it in some way, right? And they'll say, oh, I have baby elephant syndrome. But what are the features of baby elephant syndrome? What's the challenge your beliefs? Like, which are the beliefs that you should challenge? Because the whole point is that in baby elephant syndrome, the beliefs are so deep-rooted that they're not beliefs, they're facts. Right? I can't escape from the peg. This is a feature of life. And the whole problem with baby elephant syndrome is that we are inherently blinded to our conceptions. So like which are the beliefs? Like, how do you diagnose someone with baby elephant syndrome? So the way that I understand, the way it's taught in the East is that this is not a syndrome. It's not a collection of symptoms, it's a feature of the mind. So the best analogy that I can kind of think of is like in mathematics, we have formulas, right? So we have y equals mx plus b, and then we have core concepts like arithmetic or addition. And a syndrome is like a formula. It's like y equals mx plus b. It's a specific representation of reality. And then you have the core features of mathematics, like arithmetic, equals, division, parentheses, like exponentials. And so this is a core feature of the mind. It's like the plus sign. It's not actually the equation. And this is like, maybe I'm just being like academic and being kind of judgmental here. But in my opinion, it's very important to draw the distinction between what is a formula, like ADHD equals impulsivity plus this, plus this, plus this, versus how does our mind fundamentally work. And this was a discovery from sort of like the yogic tradition because they were looking at the features of the mind. So what the main discovery is it's not a syndrome. It's not like a particular thing. It's just how our mind works. And the basic idea is that we internalize particular beliefs and we operate as if these are true. So in cognitive behavioral therapy, this is what we call schemas, okay? So these are things like in object relations theory. So there's a whole branch of psychoanalysis called object relations theory, which sort of is essentially an exploration of the baby elephant principle, which is how do we, as we grow up, We form particular relationships with things outside of us. And what are those relationships? How do they form? How do we change them? It's not, so there's like a lot of specificity here that becomes really important. Because I think the real challenge with something like this is like, what is your peg, right? What is the thing that you're actually shackled to? And I don't get any sense that it's clear, right, from this. Like, I don't know how to group people into baby elephant syndrome because it's a principle of every single mind. There are a couple of other important things that we have to be careful about. So this person said that oftentimes the most successful people that they've met have issues like this, like low self-esteem. And this is where what we've got to understand is that some of these baby elephant syndromes are very, very helpful. Like, he's talking about it like it's a bad thing that holds us back. But if you look at studies of 5-factor personality analysis of doctors, okay? So remember, the 5-factor personality analysis system is like probably the best scientifically validated system of personality, okay? So it's based on a lot of research as opposed to like theory or ideas. And what they sort of found is that there are 5 factors. There's conscientiousness, neuroticism, openness, agreeableness, and extroversion. So these are kind of the 5 dimensions. So conscientiousness is your ability to like sit down and focus on a task. Neuroticism is your tendency to worry. Agreeableness is your tendency to get along or not get along with other people. Like, how willing are you to adapt your beliefs to what other people want? Openness is your openness or close-mindedness to new ideas and concepts. And extroversion is like how you relate to other people, whether you're kind of a loner or you're like, you enjoy spending time with others. And the interesting thing is, if we look at these things, we may think that some are better than others, right? So like, neuroticism is bad. The tendency to worry is bad. So people with high neuroticism, for example, may be more prone to have an anxiety disorder. Conscientiousness is good. People who have high conscientiousness can put their mind to a task and do a good job at it, like focus on it and have follow through. It's kind of like follow through. Those are better than people who have low conscientiousness. So we make all these kinds of value judgments, but the really interesting thing is that data supports that it's not really like that, okay? So for example, if you look at medical students, what you find is that medical students and doctors have high conscientiousness and high neuroticism. That high neuroticism and the tendency to worry actually correlates with higher performance. So I was listening to a really interesting story the other day of someone who was working at Amazon, and they were giving a presentation, and one of their superiors, who's a very prominent person in Amazon, was there, and the presentation did not go well. And so they were really concerned about it, and it kind of looked bad. And so their boss's boss was basically saying, he was like, I'm not worried about this. And the reason why is because I can clearly see that you are worried about it. And so being worried about something, like, they basically knew it was going to get taken care of because someone is clearly worried about it. So worrying about things and thinking that you're insufficient and lacking confidence in yourself can actually correlate with external success. So this is the weird thing about baby elephant syndrome, is we may think that we should get rid of it. But let's understand that it's responsible for someone being a best-selling author. It's responsible for someone being an excellent artist, right? The sense of inadequacy is what drives us forward. The reason that the medical student ends up as a medical student is because when they were in college and everyone else is out partying, on Friday night at 8 p.m., they were worried about not getting an A on the test, so their asses were in the library and they were studying. And so what does that mean for us? Right? So if you're someone who's got low self-esteem, if you're someone who uses the relentless whip of not being good enough to excel, and if y'all have seen our interviews with like people like, streamers and stuff who are very successful, I'm thinking of like Amaranth, for example. Amaranth is like one of the hardest workers that I've ever met. And it's because on some level she felt at some point, this is years ago, that she needed to do better, right? And it drives us forward relentlessly. And it drives us to succeed. So the challenge is that when we talk about something like this, like baby elephant syndrome, there's sort of this idea that getting rid of it is good, which generally speaking, I agree with. But there's a huge, huge problem with this, which oftentimes causes people to stumble, is they'll see something like this and they'll think like, oh my God, like I should be more confident in myself. Like I should like Stop pushing myself so hard because I am okay. And my parents taught me that I'm not okay. And then what happens when you try to get that person to accept themselves? Do y'all know? What happens when you try to help them attain self-acceptance? They resist it. They fight it at every single step, right? They may say, they'll watch a TikTok and they'll say like, oh, this is me. But deep down, they're against it 100%. And why is that? It's because it's what's responsible for their success. Right? Like what? You're telling me, because here's the thing. If you relentlessly drive yourself forward towards success and you start accepting yourself, what does that mean about your ambitions? What does that mean about your professional success? You're emptying your gas tank, poking a hole in it. It's what drives you forward. Right? So baby elephant syndrome is a little bit more complicated. The first thing is that I don't know which internal beliefs. What's the stake? What's the rope? I don't know. Right? So the general principle is 100% correct that our brain internalizes beliefs and we continue to operate based on them. Like gravity is a good example of this. When we're 2, our brain internalizes a concept of gravity and then concludes that we can't fly. Right? And so there are all kinds of things like value, like what's important, what family means. There are all kinds of other things that we'll internalize too. Like what is the relationship between a husband and a wife? Does a marriage compose of a husband and a wife? And a lot of the times the way that we behave in relationships are internalized based on what we saw our parents do. So who did the dishes? Who cooked? So these are all things that we internalize. So which ones should you challenge? Which ones are you holding you back? I don't know. Because it's not a real syndrome, right? A syndrome is a constellation of things. This is a principle of the mind which you should absolutely understand. But I don't think that it's a bad thing, right? It's just how we work. Should you challenge some of those beliefs? Absolutely. But how do you figure out which ones to challenge? The ones that you figure out which ones to challenge are the ones that the situations that bring you unhappiness. So here's what I'd say about how to approach baby elephant syndrome. The first is if you're unhappy with something, if there is something about your life that you wish were different, consider this principle. Consider how much of my current situation is because of a belief that I hold, which I take for granted. And even then, it's going to be really hard to see. This is why most of these revelations happen with someone else. So like we see this a lot in coaching or in therapy or things like that, where it takes an external person to point out to you, hey, wait a minute. You're having trouble with your relationships because you're giving people the cold shoulder after a perception that someone doesn't text you back right away. Maybe that's the problem, right? Like it requires some degree of sophistication to see what the actual problem is. The second thing to remember is that the stake in the rope serves an important purpose. Your brain wouldn't have picked it up unless it did something for you. And if you really want to overcome it, you really have to acknowledge that it's not just a stake and a rope, it's also an anchor, right? It's like a home base, it's a nest. It's all of those things. It does something for you. It's comfortable, it's familiar, it feels safe. And if you try to uproot it, you may be surprised because you uproot it and then you don't even walk anywhere, right? Because like this is what you've done to survive. So I'll ask people like, are you willing to accept yourself? And the vast majority of the people are like, hell no. They come in, they say, I want to learn how to accept myself better. As we start talking through what are the consequences of you accepting yourself? And people think, oh, I'm going to lose my ambition. And they're like, I don't want to, I work too much. I have no work-life balance. There's another really common one. I have no work-life balance. I need work-life balance. Okay, if you have more work-life balance, you know what that means, right? You're going to work less. Yeah, I need to work less. Okay, so like your chances of promotion are going to be lower. Your bonus may be smaller. No. What? I can't handle that. You're crazy. I don't want to work less. I need those things because they make choices for a reason. There's consequences to work-life balance. You know what the consequence to building work-life balance is? You have to sacrifice your work. And people are like, oh, I love sacrificing work. But when it comes down to it, like, do you? What actually motivates you? Right? Like, why do you think your work-life balance got out of whack in the first place? And this is where, like, sometimes it gets weird and psychological. It's like, yeah, my parents are Nobel Prize winning scientists, and I decided to become an artist. And so work-life balance for me is like, I can't give it up because I have to prove to them that art is a real career because they didn't tell me, they said that like I should go into a STEM field. And so there's no way, like, F it. Like, there's no way I'm going to be a disappointment to them. I'm going to show them. And work-life balance means giving that up. Proving your parents that you made the right decision. Like, people aren't willing to do that. So when we're held back by something, understand, first of all, that it's not just a chain. It's also security. It's also fuel. And you have to explore that to really give it up. Because just recognizing, oh, this is what's been holding me back, sometimes that can help, right? It can help a lot. So I'm not saying it doesn't. My point here is that baby elephant syndrome makes it sound like it's a constellation of things for there's a one-size-fits-all answer. And my whole point is that there's a lack of granularity with that concept. And that the general principle is correct, but why did the brain form that association in the first place? What does that association do for you? What are the advantages that you have to give up by getting rid of the baby elephant syndrome? Those are the things that you really have to think about. And so if you want to challenge one of these beliefs, it's hard to sort of figure it out because you're blind to it. That's kind of the nature of the problem, right? But even if you find one, it's not going to be so easy to give up because there are all kinds of associations with it. There are all kinds of things that this thing gives you. It gives you security. It lets you be promoted. It gives you a sense of satisfaction when you're the one who gets into medical school and you're one of the 15% of applicants who actually gets in. There's no way you're going to be in that 85%. Are you kidding me? Self-acceptance and be one of these noobs that didn't get in? F that. Right? So if it is causing you problems, what do? The good news is that oftentimes, and generally speaking, I've noticed this, especially for ambition, there are alternatives. That if you let go of your ambition, it doesn't mean that your work ethic has to go away. Oftentimes, the other interesting thing is that they assume that ambition equals work ethic. But if you've entrained some amount of work ethic through ambition and you let go of your ambition, the work ethic isn't going to just disappear with it. Right? That's a habit that you've born in. So oftentimes, here's what I found with these people. The first is that they overvalue the contribution of ambition to their performance. And that oftentimes their performance there's a certain independence to it that's free of your ambition. The second thing is you can still care about stuff without personal ambition. So this is where you can really, I think the best performance comes from not ambition, but actually comes from like the flow state and a sense of service. And so why is a sense of service correlated with the flow state? Is because the flow state is free of the ego. Ambition is tied to the ego. I want to accomplish this. And the best work actually happens when you're free of ego. When you remove yourself from the equation, you become one with the thing that you are doing. You are no longer the writer. Like the book is coming out of you. You're like channeling this book. Like there's a story within you that needs to be told. You are a conduit for this like music that is coming from some weird dimension. And this is what my experience has been with people who are athletes, esports athletes, and creative people. Right? That when you enter the flow state, even coders, when you enter that flow state, you disappear. Your ambition disappears. And you're just like, you see it. And the code fits together and you know how to make it happen. And all of the accolades, all of the pride, all of the good job, bro, like all of that leaves your mind. And then you actually reach the heights of performance. So here's the bitter pill about ambition and some of this self-flagellation and elephant syndrome, is that elephant syndrome will get you from 0 to 90%. But if you want to go from 90 to 100, you have to let it go, which is the most terrifying thing because it's gotten you to 90, right? And so recognize that it's terrifying. But if you really want to go that extra level, this is where I agree with this guy too, because he's sort of saying you need to move past this, right? And I think he's right. He knows what he's talking about. Some of that is, I think, the consequence of TikTok, which is like you just can't go into this nuance. But if you want to go that next step, you want to go that next level, you have to become one with the object. This is also what is called dhyan in Sanskrit. So this is why I think terminology is important, because the more precise your terminology, the more you can understand and differentiate between things. So dhyan is when one becomes absorbed with the object of meditation. When you become one with the thing. And that is the first step. That is actually the meditative state. When people say, I had an awesome meditation yesterday, what the hell are they talking about? They're talking about a state of absorption of their mind with the object of meditation, where they disappear. And if you practice being in that state, you can go one step further into samadhi, which is temporary enlightenment. So someone saying, I hit dhyan running all the time, completely agree. So marathon runners are the people who have been the easiest to teach meditation to, because they're already familiar with it. Okay, but if future orientation correlated with ambition is bad, then why does it work so well for a lot of people? I never said it was bad. Remember, quite the opposite. Ambition is what gets you from 0 to 90%. That's why it's so popular, because it works. It's the easiest way to become successful. But it comes at a cost. I do think there are better ways to do it. They're just harder. And it caps out somewhere, right? Because the problem with ambition is the price you pay for success is your happiness when you're ambitious. You may say, what does that mean? The price you pay for success is happiness. Like, what? That's ridiculous. You talk to people who are ambitious. When they achieve, are they content? No. Are they happy? No. I made $100,000 this year. Next year, it's going to be 200. I got promoted. Am I content? No. I'm going to celebrate a little bit, and it's back to the grind, back to the hustle. There's always more. There's always more. That's the problem with ambition. So contentment and ambition are opposites, right? Like, we think of them as like, if I'm content, that means I'm not ambitious. That's the mistake that they make. So you can still be content and work hard. That's the thing that people don't understand, is there are alternatives to ambition. I think service is the number one thing to think of, right? You can work really hard, not for yourself, for other people. Like, and that's incredibly fulfilling, makes you happy, and causes your work ethic to be awesome. Okay? Isn't elephant syndrome just learned helplessness, though? It can be, yeah. But I'd say it goes deeper than learned helplessness. It's just this core concept. So it's like, it's learning at its core. So what kind of learning did you do? Did you learn helplessness? Sure. Okay, let's go ahead and meditate. What if our ambition outweighs our work ethic? Then we suffer. Right? Very common. What are the problem? I forget what the exact quote is, but someone was kind of saying, the tragedy of man is that their ambitions outweigh their capabilities. Right? And ambition can't be satisfied. That's the problem. And almost always, ambition is going to outweigh your work ethic. Yeah, someone's saying that's how I got destroyed. That's what it does to you. But remember, ambition is like, I'm trying to think about what's a good analogy? It's kind of like renewable energy versus not renewable energy, like solar versus like fossil fuels, right? So it pollutes the environment, but boy, does it make the world run. That's what ambition is. It's like the dirty fuel. Ambition is tied to ego, yes, but ego transcends ambition. So ambition is tied to ego, but ego is more than ambition, is what I would say. So what instead of ambition? Service. That's the simplest answer, right? Do it for someone else. You'll still work really hard. You'll still do a good job. The challenge with service is that a lot of people will take advantage of that, right? So anyway, let's meditate. So I'm going to teach y'all an internalizing meditation today, okay? So what we're going to do is a sound-based meditation, and it's going to be kind of like tricky. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by observing external sounds, okay? Then what we're going to do is start by observing where the sound enters our being and our awareness. So we're going to kind of notice the faculty of sound. And then what we're going to do is notice internal sounds. What are all the sounds that are coming from within? So there's like sounds out here, there's a barrier, and then there's an entry to within, then there are sounds within. And this is where things are going to get kind of weird. Even within, there's a barrier, and there's something underneath that. And what we're going to try to listen to, and I know it sounds weird, but we're going to listen to internal sounds, and then I want you to try to hear silence. Underneath all of the sounds, there's going to be a silence that's hard to detect. It may take you months, okay? But then listen to what's the barrier of what's underneath the sound from within, okay? All right, so we're gonna close our eyes and take a moment to just breathe. So let's start with 3 or 4 breaths. And now I want you to start by listening to the sounds around you. So whatever you hear, notice that sound. At the beginning, what we're going to want to do is rotate between sounds. So if you hear one sound, then try to listen to something else, and then listen to something else. Just listen to the sounds around you. You may hear humming or wind, fans, my voice. And you may also notice that beyond those external sounds, there's actually like a baseline sound of silence. Sometimes it almost sounds like a high-pitched tone. So what I want you to do is focus on the fluctuant sounds at the surface. A fan, a car horn, my voice. And then underneath that, beyond all of that, almost backstage, there's a baseline sound, and hear that. If you have difficulty concentrating, you can spend more time rotating between sounds. This practice can be done potentially easier in places where there's lots of noise. And then as you learn to practice, you'll hear the sound of silence beyond noise. And now I want you to focus on where these sounds enter your being. Notice the barrier between you and the outside world. That the sound is out there, and you may even give it a location and space, but the hearing is within. It can sometimes help to even focus on your ears and see the sound entering from your ears. May sound strange, but clearly the sound doesn't enter through your hands, it doesn't enter through your knees. So there's a transition point where a sound becomes hearing. And now we're going to move within. So now I want you to hear the sounds from within. You may hear breath, the sound of swallowing, as you practice, you may even be able to discern the sound of your heartbeat. If you're having difficulty, you can use earplugs or headphones or even just plug your ears. And you may notice with your ears plugged that there's a roar of sound within you. The core rumbling. But if your ears are plugged, you may not be able to hear my voice. So as you tune into those internal sounds, this becomes the goal, but the hard part. In the same way that there is a sound of silence outside, there's a sound of silence within. Listen for it. So now I'll ask you, if you haven't, or if you have, to do one more time. For about 1 more minute, we're going to plug our ears and immerse ourselves in internal sound. And try to hear the sound of silence beyond the roar that is within, beyond the internal ocean. With a deep breath, plug your ears, and we'll continue for about 60 seconds. And now go ahead and come on back. Let your awareness return to the world. Open your eyes. So the cool thing about a practice like that is that you disappear. Right? Like we're back with the world. There's like stuff going on. You have to figure out who to raid. We're going to do announcements. You may be hungry. You got something to do today. It's the weekend. But for a few moments, you're just lost in the ocean of internal sound. And you stay there for a while and you listen to the waves for a while. And try to find what's beyond that. What's beyond that ocean? Is there true silence when the ocean of sound kind of disappears? What's left? For those of you that have tinnitus, I'm sorry. Okay, so a couple things. So we're out next week. Stay posted to our socials, especially Instagram, and you guys may get teasers of what we're up to. Week 3 of Month of Meditation is almost over, so we're going to go through repeat practices over the weekend. So check it out on Discord if y'all have missed it. And then last week is our month of meditation, and we'll be doing inquisitive meditation, some of my favorite. So we're going to be focused on things like neti neti, which is what am I? What is the self? It's not this, not this. So if y'all are interested in some of the more metaphysical or philosophical concepts of meditation, definitely join in next week. Because meditation is not really about philosophy. It's about an experience that then we will use philosophy to describe. But philosophy is like something to be logically understood, right? It's not necessarily something to be experienced, unless you're talking about something like Stoicism. So I think that's a good example of how there's the truth and then there's our approximation of the truth. So hopefully some good stuff there. And who are we rating, by the way? Okay. Let's go ahead and raid. Is Maya streaming? Yep. We can raid. That's fine. People will seem to like Northern Lion a lot, so we'll raid. We'll raid Northern Lion. We'll raid Maya next time, okay? Oh, she's doing an art auction? Okay, let's do Maya then. She's doing some kind of charity thing. Cool. So check it out. We'll see y'all maybe week after next. Love y'all. Take care. GG. Adios.